Some warriors won battles, a rare few won wars, but these men did something even more extraordinary. They never knew defeat. From Alexander the Great to Khalid Ibn al-Walid, from Subutai, the Mongol mastermind, to Sunsen, the admiral who refused to fall. Their enemies were many. Their odds were impossible. Their names became legend. Tonight, on Educational Bedtime, we follow the lives of the warriors who never lost a single battle.
Chapter 1: Alexander the Great, the boy who conquered the world. Imagine being just 20 years old and deciding that you want to conquer the entire known world, not just your neighboring countries, not just your continent, but literally everywhere that people had ever heard of. Now imagine actually doing it, winning every single battle you ever fought, and creating an empire so vast that it stretched from Greece to India. This isn't a fantasy story or a video game. This is the real life of Alexander the Great, a young man who became the most successful military commander in human history and never ever lost a battle. Alexander was born in 356 BC in a kingdom called Macedon, which was located in what we now call northern Greece. His father was King Philip II, a brilliant military leader who had already begun expanding Macedonian power. But even as a small child, it was clear that Alexander was something special. He wasn't just smart, he was extraordinarily intelligent, curious about everything, and had a magnetic personality that made people want to follow him anywhere. When Alexander was just 13 years old, his father hired the most famous teacher in the ancient world to educate his son. That teacher was Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. Can you imagine having Aristotle as your personal tutor? For 3 years, Aristotle taught Alexander about science, medicine, literature, and philosophy, but most importantly, he taught him to think critically and to always ask questions about how the world worked. Aristotle filled Alexander's mind with stories from Homer's Iliad, the ancient Greek poem about the Trojan War. Alexander became obsessed with Achilles, the greatest warrior in the story, and began to see himself as a new Achilles, destined for greatness. He even carried a copy of the Iliad with him on all his campaigns, keeping it under his pillow at night like other people might keep a favorite book. But Alexander wasn't just a bookworm. He was also incredibly athletic and brave, even as a young teenager. When he was 12 years old, something happened that showed everyone just how special this boy was. A horse dealer brought a magnificent but completely wild horse to King Philip's court. This horse, named Bucephalus, was so fierce and uncontrollable that no one could even get close to it, let alone ride it. All the grown men, including experienced cavalry officers, tried to tame Bucephalus and failed. The horse would rear up on its hind legs, strike out with its hooves, and refused to let anyone mount it. King Philip was about to send the horse away when young Alexander spoke up. He had been watching carefully, and he noticed something that all the adults had missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. Alexander approached Bucephalus calmly, turned the horse toward the sun so it couldn't see its shadow, and then gently mounted it. The horse immediately calmed down and allowed Alexander to ride. King Philip was so amazed that he bought the horse for Alexander, and Bucephalus became his beloved companion for the next 20 years. It was as if the horse recognized that Alexander was destined for greatness and wanted to be part of that journey. When Alexander was 16, his father gave him his first real taste of leadership. Philip had to leave Macedon to fight a campaign, so he left Alexander in charge of the kingdom as regent. Most 16-year-olds would have been content to just keep things running smoothly until their father returned. But Alexander saw an opportunity to prove himself. When a tribe called the Mede rebelled against Macedonian rule, Alexander personally led an army against them, defeated them completely, and founded a new city on the site of their capital. This wasn't beginner's luck, it was a preview of what was to come. Alexander had shown that he could command troops, make strategic decisions, and win battles while still a teenager. His father was proud, but probably also a little worried. He could see that his son was incredibly ambitious and might not be content to wait patiently for his turn to rule. In 338 BC, when Alexander was 18, he fought alongside his father in the Battle of Chaeronea against a coalition of Greek city-states. This battle would determine whether Macedon would become the dominant power in Greece. Alexander commanded the cavalry on the left wing of the Macedonian army, and his brilliant charge broke through the enemy lines and helped win the battle decisively. After Chaeronea, Philip controlled most of Greece and began planning an even more ambitious campaign, an invasion of the Persian Empire, the largest and richest empire in the world. The Persians had been the enemies of the Greeks for over a century, and Philip saw conquering them as his greatest challenge. But fate had other plans. In 336 BC, at a wedding celebration, King Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The killer's motives were never entirely clear. It might have been a personal grudge, or it might have been a political conspiracy. But suddenly, 20-year-old Alexander found himself the king of Macedon, with enemies surrounding him on all sides. Many people expected the young king to fail. After all, he was barely an adult, he had no experience ruling a kingdom, and there were rebellions breaking out everywhere. Some Greek city-states declared their independence, thinking that a boy king couldn't possibly control them the way his father had. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Alexander's response to these rebellions was swift and decisive. He marched south with his army and crushed the rebellions one by one. When the city of Thebes revolted and killed the Macedonian garrison stationed there, Alexander made an example that would be remembered for centuries. He completely destroyed the city, sold the surviving population into slavery, and left only the temples and the house of the great poet Pindar standing. This might seem harsh, but Alexander understood something important about leadership. Sometimes you have to be ruthless to prevent even greater bloodshed. His destruction of Thebes sent a message to every other Greek city. Rebellion against Alexander would result in total destruction. As a result, the other Greek cities quickly submitted, and Alexander didn't have to fight any more rebellions. With Greece secure, Alexander could finally pursue the dream that his father had died before achieving, the conquest of the Persian Empire. In 334 BC, at the age of just 22, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, with an army of about 35,000 men. He was leaving the familiar world of Greece behind and heading into the vast unknown territories of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was enormous. It stretched from modern-day Turkey all the way to India and included parts of Egypt and Central Asia. It had been around for over 200 years and seemed unbeatable. The Persian king, Darius III, had hundreds of thousands of soldiers at his command, unlimited wealth, and the advantage of fighting on his home territory. On paper, Alexander's small Macedonian army didn't stand a chance, but Alexander had several advantages that weren't immediately obvious. First, his army was incredibly well trained and disciplined. The Macedonian phalanx was a formation of soldiers with long spears that could punch through almost any enemy line. Second, Alexander was a tactical genius who could adapt his strategy to any situation. And third, he had something that couldn't be measured or counted. He had the absolute loyalty and devotion of his men, who believed that he was invincible. Alexander's first major battle in Asia was at the Granicus River in 334 BC. The Persian generals had positioned their army on the far side of a river, thinking that Alexander wouldn't dare attack across such difficult terrain. They were wrong. Alexander personally led the cavalry charge across the river, fighting in the front ranks, and nearly getting killed when a Persian nobleman struck him with an axe. But the Macedonians broke through, won the battle decisively, and announced to the world that a new conqueror had arrived. After the Granicus, Alexander began moving down the coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, liberating Greek cities that had been under Persian control and winning the loyalty of local populations who had been oppressed by Persian rule. But he wasn't just conquering, he was also being smart about politics. Instead of treating the conquered peoples as enemies, Alexander often adopted local customs and incorporated foreign soldiers into his army. In 333 BC, Alexander won perhaps his most famous victory at the Battle of Issus. King Darius III had personally come to fight against Alexander with a huge army. Some sources say it numbered over 100,000 men. The two armies met in a narrow coastal plain where Darius couldn't use his numerical advantage effectively. Alexander's battle plan at Issus was brilliant in its simplicity. While his infantry held the center, Alexander led his cavalry in a charge directly at the Persian royal bodyguard, where Darius was positioned. The sight of the young Macedonian king charging straight at him with his cavalry was too much for Darius. The Persian king fled the battlefield, leaving behind his army, his royal tent, and even his family. The victory at Issus was more than just a military triumph. It was a psychological breakthrough. Alexander had defeated the great king of Persia in personal combat and proven that the Persian Empire was not invincible. Word of the victory spread throughout the ancient world, and suddenly everyone was talking about the young Macedonian, who seemed unstoppable. But Alexander wasn't content to just defeat one Persian army. He wanted to conquer the entire empire, and that meant taking control of Egypt, the wealthy Persian province that controlled the grain supply for much of the ancient world. Instead of pursuing Darius immediately, Alexander turned south and marched toward Egypt. The conquest of Egypt turned out to be surprisingly easy. The Egyptians had been unhappy under Persian rule, and they welcomed Alexander as a liberator. When he reached the ancient capital of Memphis, the Egyptian priests declared him to be the son of the god Amun-Ra, making him pharaoh by divine right. Alexander accepted this religious honor and founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, which he modestly named Alexandria after himself. Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and a center of learning and culture. But Alexander didn't have time to enjoy his new city. He had an empire to conquer. After securing Egypt, he turned east and headed into the heart of the Persian Empire to find Darius and finish what he had started. The final confrontation between Alexander and Darius came in 331 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now Iraq. Darius had spent 2 years preparing for this battle, assembling the largest army in Persian history, perhaps 250,000 men, including war elephants, scythe chariots, and cavalry from across the empire. He had even chosen the battlefield himself, a large flat plain where he could use his numerical advantage. Alexander had only about 47,000 men, but he had spent the previous night studying the terrain and developing a battle plan that would become one of the masterpieces of military history. When the battle began, Alexander used a complex series of movements to create a gap in the Persian line, then led his cavalry through that gap in a charge aimed directly at Darius. Once again, the sight of Alexander charging toward him proved too much for the Persian king. Darius fled the battlefield, and his massive army collapsed without their leader. The victory at Gaugamela effectively ended the Persian Empire and made Alexander the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But Alexander still wasn't satisfied. Instead of stopping to consolidate his conquests, he kept pushing east into territories that even the Persians hadn't fully controlled. He marched through Afghanistan, crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains, and eventually reached India, where he defeated local rulers and added even more territory to his empire. In India, Alexander faced some of his toughest battles. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, he defeated King Porus, who fought from the back of a war elephant. The battle was so fierce that Alexander's beloved horse, Bucephalus, was mortally wounded. Alexander was heartbroken. Bucephalus had been with him for 20 years and had carried him through every one of his victories. He founded a city on the spot where Bucephalus died, naming it Bucephala, in honor of his faithful companion. Alexander wanted to continue conquering eastward, possibly all the way to China, but his soldiers had finally had enough. They had been marching and fighting for over 10 years. They were thousands of miles from home, and they missed their families. At a place called the Hyphobes River, Alexander's army essentially went on strike, refusing to march any further east. This was probably the most difficult moment in Alexander's life. He had never been defeated in battle, never been told no by his soldiers, and never been forced to stop when he wanted to keep going. He spent 3 days in his tent, hoping his men would change their minds, but finally he realized that even he couldn't force his army to continue against their will. Reluctantly, Alexander agreed to turn back, but instead of simply retracing their steps, he decided to explore new routes back to the west. Part of his army sailed down the Indus River and then along the coast of the Arabian Sea, while Alexander led the rest overland through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. The march through the desert was a nightmare. Water was scarce, the heat was unbearable, and many soldiers died from thirst and exhaustion. But Alexander shared every hardship with his men, marching on foot when his horse died, and refusing water when there wasn't enough for everyone. This was the kind of leadership that made soldiers willing to follow him anywhere. He never asked them to endure anything he wouldn't endure himself. By 324 BC, Alexander had returned to Babylon, which he planned to make the capital of his empire. He was only 31 years old, but he had accomplished more than most people could achieve in 10 lifetimes. He controlled territory stretching from Greece to India, had founded over 20 cities, and had never lost a single battle in over 15 years of campaigning. But Alexander's greatest achievement wasn't just military conquest, it was cultural fusion. Unlike other conquerors who simply imposed their own culture on defeated peoples, Alexander encouraged the blending of Greek and Eastern traditions. He married a Persian princess, encouraged his soldiers to marry local women, and adopted Persian court customs. He was creating a new kind of empire, one that celebrated diversity rather than trying to eliminate it. Tragically, Alexander's story came to an abrupt end in 323 BC. While planning new campaigns in Arabia and possibly the Western Mediterranean, he fell ill with a fever in Babylon. Some historians think it was malaria, others suspect typhoid fever, and some even suggest he was poisoned. Whatever the cause, the man who had seemed invincible in battle was defeated by microscopic enemies he couldn't fight. Alexander died on June 10, 3023 BC, just a month before his 33rd birthday. He had lived an incredibly short life, but in those 32 years, he had changed the world forever. His empire immediately broke apart after his death, as his generals fought each other for control of different regions. But the cultural changes he had set in motion continued for centuries. The cities Alexander founded became centers of learning and trade. The Greek language and culture spread throughout the ancient world. Scientific and mathematical knowledge was shared between different civilizations. In many ways, Alexander created the first truly global culture, bringing together ideas and traditions from dozens of different peoples. Alexander the Great's military record remains unmatched in history. He never lost a battle, never retreated from an enemy, and conquered more territory than any other individual. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't his victories, but his vision of a world where different cultures could coexist and learn from each other. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Alexander leading his cavalry charge at Gaugamela, or crossing the mountains into India, or sharing his water with a dying soldier in the desert. Remember that he was hardly older than many college students today when he began conquering the world, but he had the courage to dream impossible dreams and the determination to make them reality. Alexander proved that with enough vision, courage, and leadership, even the most impossible goals can be achieved. He showed that true greatness isn't just about winning battles, but about inspiring people to believe in something larger than themselves. And he demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victory is bringing people together rather than keeping them apart. Sweet dreams, and may you have even a fraction of Alexander's courage to pursue your own impossible dreams. His legacy reminds us that the only limits are the ones we place on ourselves, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single step into the unknown. Chapter 2. Khalid Ibn al-Walid, the Sword of God. Picture this. You're so good at fighting that your enemies literally call you the Sword of God, believing that no mortal man could possibly be that skilled in battle. You fought in over 100 battles across deserts, mountains, and plains, and you've never been defeated, not even once. Enemy armies flee at the mention of your name, and your own soldiers believe you're blessed with supernatural powers. This isn't mythology or legend. This is the real story of Khalid ibn al-Walid, an Arab warrior who became the greatest military tactician of his time and earned a nickname that still gives historians chills, Saif Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God. Khalid was born around 592 AD in Mecca into one of the most powerful and wealthy families in Arabia. His father, al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, was a successful merchant and tribal leader who made sure his son received the best education available. But this wasn't the kind of education you might imagine. Instead of sitting in classrooms reading books, young Khalid learned the skills that mattered most in 7th century Arabia: how to ride a horse like he was born in the saddle, how to fight with a sword until it became an extension of his own arm, and how to lead men in the harsh desert environment where weakness meant death. Arabia, in Khalid's time, was a tough place to grow up. It was a land of scattered tribes who spent as much time fighting each other as they did trading and herding camels. Water was precious, resources were scarce, and survival often depended on your ability to raid your neighbors before they raided you. In this environment, military skill wasn't just useful, it was essential for staying alive. From an early age, Khalid showed an almost supernatural talent for warfare. He could predict how enemy forces would move before they did it themselves. He understood terrain like a master chess player understands the board, and he had an instinctive grasp of cavalry tactics that would make him famous across the known world. His friends and family could see that he wasn't just good at fighting, he was destined to be one of the great warriors of his generation. When Khalid was a young man, a religious revolution began in Mecca that would change the course of world history. A merchant named Muhammad started preaching about a new faith called Islam, claiming that he was God's messenger, bringing a final revelation to humanity. This new religion attracted many followers, but it also created fierce opposition from the established tribes and religious leaders who saw it as a threat to their power. Initially, Khalid's tribe, the Banu Maksum, was strongly opposed to Muhammad and his followers. They were part of the traditional power structure in Mecca, and they saw Islam as a dangerous disruption to the way things had always been done. When conflicts broke out between the early Muslims and their opponents, Khalid found himself fighting against the Muslim forces. But here's where Khalid's story becomes really interesting. Even when he was fighting against the Muslims, his tactical brilliance was already becoming legendary. In several early battles, Khalid's cavalry charges broke Muslim formations and sent their forces retreating. The Muslims quickly learned to respect and fear this young cavalry commander who seemed to anticipate their every move. The most famous example of Khalid's early military genius came at the Battle of Uhud in 625 AD. The Muslim army had initially gained the upper hand against the Meccan forces, but Khalid was commanding the cavalry for the non-Muslim side. When he saw an opportunity, he led his horsemen in a flanking attack that completely changed the course of the battle. His cavalry charge scattered the Muslim archers who were protecting the rear of their army, then swung around to attack the main Muslim force from behind. The tactical maneuver was so perfectly executed that it turned what looked like a Muslim victory into a devastating defeat. Even Muhammad himself was wounded in the battle. The Muslims were forced to retreat, and Khalid's reputation as a military genius was established. He had shown that he could read a battle like a book and execute complex tactical movements with perfect timing. But something remarkable happened after this battle. Despite his success against the Muslims, Khalid began to think seriously about the religion his enemies were fighting for. He started to notice that the Muslim soldiers fought with a different kind of courage, not just bravery born of tribal loyalty, but something deeper, something that seemed to come from genuine faith in their cause. Khalid was a practical man, and he could see that Islam was spreading rapidly throughout Arabia. But more than that, he was beginning to be impressed by the character and leadership of Muhammad himself. Here was a man who treated his enemies with mercy, who preached justice and equality, and who seemed to genuinely care about creating a better world. Slowly, Khalid began to question whether he was fighting on the right side. In 629 AD, something extraordinary happened. Khalid made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He converted to Islam and joined the Muslim army. This wasn't just a personal religious conversion. It was like LeBron James deciding to join the team he had been playing against his entire career. Suddenly, the Muslims had gained one of the greatest military minds of the age. Muhammad welcomed Khalid with open arms, recognizing that this conversion was a game changer for the Muslim cause. More importantly, Muhammad gave Khalid a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Saif Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God. It was as if Muhammad was saying that God had finally unsheathed his ultimate weapon. Khalid's first major campaign as a Muslim was the expedition to Mu'tah in 6029 AD, and it immediately showed why his conversion was so important. The Muslim army had suffered a devastating defeat. Their commanders had been killed, and the surviving forces were in full retreat with a much larger Byzantine army pursuing them. It looked like a complete disaster that might end the Muslim expansion forever. But then Khalid took command of the retreating forces, and something miraculous happened. Using his incredible tactical skills, he managed to reorganize the scattered Muslim troops and conduct a fighting retreat so skillful that the pursuing Byzantine army began to think they were walking into a trap. Khalid kept changing his formations, rotating fresh troops to the rear guard, and using the terrain so cleverly that what had started as a disastrous defeat was turned into a strategic withdrawal that saved the entire Muslim army. The soldiers under Khalid's command were amazed by what they witnessed. Here was a man who could turn defeat into victory through sheer tactical brilliance. Word spread throughout the Muslim world that they now had a commander who seemed capable of working miracles on the battlefield. After Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Khalid became one of the key military leaders during the Ridda Wars, the conflicts that arose when some Arabian tribes tried to break away from the new Islamic State. These wars were crucial for the survival of Islam as a political and religious force. If the Muslim state had collapsed at this early stage, world history would have been completely different. Khalid's role in the Ridda Wars was decisive. He led rapid cavalry campaigns across the Arabian Peninsula, defeating rebel tribes with a combination of speed, surprise, and tactical superiority that his enemies simply couldn't match. His forces would appear suddenly from the desert, strike with devastating effectiveness, and disappear before the enemy could organize a proper response. One of his most famous victories during this period came against a powerful false prophet named Musaylima at the Battle of Zafar. Musaylima had gathered a large army and was claiming to be a prophet equal to Muhammad. Khalid's defeat of this rebel was so complete and decisive that it effectively ended the major threats to Muslim unity in Arabia. But Khalid's greatest achievements were still to come. In 634 AD, he was sent to Iraq to support Muslim forces who were struggling against the powerful Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians were one of the two great superpowers of the time, along with the Byzantine Empire, and they had professional armies with better equipment and more experience than the relatively new Muslim forces. Khalid's campaign in Iraq was like a master class in military strategy. He didn't just win battles, he revolutionized how wars were fought in that region. Instead of meeting the Sasanian armies in traditional set-piece battles where their superior numbers and equipment would give them an advantage, Khalid used mobility and surprise to keep his enemies off balance. His cavalry forces moved like lightning across the Iraqi desert, striking at enemy supply lines, capturing key cities, and forcing the Sasanians to fight on his terms rather than their own. The Battle of Kazima was typical of his approach. He used a double envelopment tactic, surrounding the enemy from two sides simultaneously, that resulted in such a devastating victory that the battlefield was later called the River of Blood. The Sasavanians quickly learned to fear Khalid's name. Their commanders would hesitate to engage his forces, and their soldiers would sometimes abandon positions just on hearing that he was approaching. This psychological warfare was just as important as his tactical skills. When your enemies are already defeated in their minds before the battle begins, the actual fighting becomes much easier. But just when Khalid was on the verge of completely conquering Iraq, he received new orders that would lead to his most famous campaign. The Caliph, the political leader of the Muslim world, ordered him to march to Syria, where Muslim forces were struggling against the Byzantine Empire. The problem was that between Iraq and Syria lay hundreds of miles of some of the most dangerous desert in the world. Most commanders would have marched their army back through friendly territory, then approached Syria by a safer route. But Khalid wasn't most commanders. He decided to do something that military historians still consider one of the most audacious moves in warfare history. He would march his entire army directly across the Syrian desert, covering over 500 miles of trackless wasteland in just 18 days. This desert march has become legendary, and for good reason. Khalid had to navigate by the stars, find or create water sources for thousands of men and horses, and keep his army combat ready while crossing terrain that had defeated many previous expeditions. His solution to the water problem was particularly ingenious. He brought camels along not just to carry supplies, but as emergency water sources, since camels can store water in their bodies for long periods. The march itself was an incredible feat of logistics and leadership. Khalid divided his army into smaller groups that could move more quickly and put less strain on water sources. He sent scouts ahead to locate oases and plan the route carefully. Most importantly, he shared every hardship with his men, walking when they walked, going without water when supplies were short, and never asking them to endure anything he wouldn't endure himself. During the most difficult part of the crossing, when water ran desperately low, Khalid made a decision that showed both his tactical brilliance and his willingness to take extreme risks. He ordered his men to give the remaining water to the horses rather than drinking it themselves. This seemed crazy at first. Why prioritize animals over human soldiers? But Khalid understood that without their horses, his cavalry would be useless when they reached Syria. His men trusted him enough to follow this order, even though it meant marching through the desert while desperately thirsty. When Khalid's army emerged from the desert and appeared suddenly on the outskirts of Damascus, the Byzantine defenders couldn't believe their eyes. They had been expecting him to approach from the south along the normal invasion routes. Instead, he had materialized from the empty desert like a mirage, with his forces fresh and ready to fight after their impossible march. The psychological impact of this desert crossing was enormous. The Byzantines realized they were facing a commander who could do things that seemed impossible, who could appear anywhere at any time, and who had the kind of tactical brilliance that turned normal military logic upside down. Before Khalid had even fought a major battle in Syria, his reputation was already working in his favor. The siege of Damascus that followed showed all of Khalid's skills at their peak. Instead of a traditional siege where the attackers would surround the city and wait for the defenders to surrender, Khalid used a mobile approach that kept the Byzantine forces guessing. He would attack different parts of the city's defenses, withdraw before the defenders could mass against him, then strike somewhere else entirely. During one famous incident at Damascus, Khalid actually infiltrated the city at night with a small group of his best soldiers. They climbed the walls, opened the gates from inside, and let the main Muslim army pour into the city before the defenders knew what was happening. It was the kind of bold, personal leadership that made his soldiers believe he really was protected by divine power. The conquest of Damascus was just the beginning of Khalid's Syrian campaign. Over the next few years, he won victory after victory against Byzantine forces, often against overwhelming odds. His tactics became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from fighting different types of enemies in various terrains. At the Battle of Fiel, Khalid faced a massive Byzantine army that outnumbered his forces by more than 2-1. The Byzantines were confident that their superior numbers would guarantee victory, but Khalid used the terrain to his advantage, positioning his forces so that the enemy couldn't bring their full strength to bear at once. Then he used a series of feinting attacks to draw parts of the Byzantine army out of position before launching his devastating cavalry charge at exactly the right moment. The victory at Fik was so complete that it effectively ended serious Byzantine resistance in southern Syria. But Khalid's greatest triumph was yet to come at a place that would become synonymous with his name, Yarmouk. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD was the decisive confrontation between the Muslim armies and a massive Byzantine force led by Emperor Heraclius himself. The Byzantines had assembled what was probably the largest army they had ever fielded against the Muslims. Estimates range from 80,000 to over 200,000 men, including the empire's best troops and most experienced commanders. Khalid commanded only about 40,000 men, but he had been studying the terrain around Yarmouk for months, planning the battle that would either secure Muslim control of Syria or end their expansion forever. The battlefield was a plateau surrounded by steep ravines, perfect for the kind of tactical masterpiece that Khalid was about to create. The battle lasted for several days, with both armies maneuvering for advantage. Khalid used this time to wear down the Byzantine forces through constant skirmishing, while keeping his own army fresh and ready for the decisive moment. He also used psychological warfare, spreading rumors and misinformation that made the Byzantine commanders uncertain about his true intentions. When Khalid finally launched his main attack, it was a thing of beauty for military historians and a nightmare for his enemies. He used a complex double envelopment that surrounded the Byzantine army on three sides, while using the terrain to block their retreat. His cavalry charges were coordinated with infantry attacks in a way that gave the Byzantines no time to reorganize their defenses. The climax of the battle came when Khalid personally led a cavalry charge that broke through the Byzantine center and caused their entire army to collapse. Emperor Heraclius himself barely escaped capture, and the Byzantine casualties were so heavy that the empire never again seriously challenged Muslim control of Syria. Yarmouk wasn't just a military victory, it was the battle that secured the Muslim conquest of the Levant and opened the path for further expansion into North Africa and Spain. And it was won primarily through the tactical genius of one man who had never lost a battle in his entire career. But here's where Khalid's story takes an unexpected turn. Despite his incredible success and his status as the greatest military commander of his time, the new caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, made a shocking decision. He removed Khalid from military command. Umar's reasoning was both wise and heartbreaking. He was worried that people were beginning to worship Khalid rather than God, that they were attributing victories to Khalid's personal abilities rather than to divine blessing. I have not dismissed Khalid because of any fault, Umar explained, but because people have begun to rely on him instead of on God. This decision shows the remarkable character of both men involved. Umar was wise enough to recognize that even the greatest military success could become a spiritual danger if people started believing that victory came from human ability rather than divine guidance. And Khalid was noble enough to accept this decision without complaint or rebellion. Khalid accepted this decision with grace and dignity, showing the same character that had made him a great leader in battle. He retired to private life in Syria, where he lived quietly until his death, around 638 AD. He never complained about being removed from command, never tried to rebel against the caliph's decision, and never lost his faith in the cause he had served so brilliantly. When Khalid died, he reportedly said on his deathbed, "I have fought in so many battles seeking martyrdom that there is no spot on my body that does not have a scar from a sword, spear, or arrow. Yet here I am, dying in my bed like a camel. May the eyes of cowards never sleep." Even in death, he remained the warrior who had never known defeat. Khalid ibn al-Walid's military record is almost impossible to believe. Over 100 battles fought, 0 defeats. He revolutionized cavalry tactics, mastered desert warfare, and showed a level of strategic thinking that wouldn't be matched for centuries. But beyond his tactical genius, Khalid represented something even more important: the idea that with enough skill, courage, and faith, even the most impossible odds could be overcome. His nickname, the Sword of God, wasn't just a compliment, it was a recognition that some individuals seemed to be chosen by fate to change the course of history. Khalid appeared at exactly the right moment in the expansion of Islam, providing the military leadership that turned a new religion into a world empire. What made Khalid truly extraordinary wasn't just his tactical brilliance, though he certainly had that in abundance. It was his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his troops, to adapt his strategies to any type of enemy or terrain, and to maintain his effectiveness across decades of constant warfare. His soldiers would follow him anywhere because they had seen him turn impossible situations into decisive victories time and time again. Khalid's innovations in cavalry tactics influenced military doctrine for centuries after his death. His use of mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare became standard practices for successful commanders throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Even today, military academies study his campaigns as examples of how superior strategy and leadership can overcome numerical disadvantages. Perhaps most remarkably, Khalid managed to maintain his undefeated record while fighting against completely different types of enemies using various military systems. He defeated tribal warriors in Arabia, professional armies in Iraq and Syria, and imperial forces from two of the world's great superpowers. Each type of enemy required different tactics and strategies, and Khalid mastered them all. The Desert March from Iraq to Syria remains one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history, comparable to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps or Alexander's march through the Hindu Kush. But while those famous marches were primarily about getting armies from one place to another, Khalid's desert crossing was also a psychological weapon that completely surprised and demoralized his enemies. Khalid's story also demonstrates the importance of adaptability in military leadership. When he was fighting against the Muslims, he used one set of tactics. When he converted and began fighting for Islam, he adapted his approach to serve different strategic objectives. When he moved from the tribal warfare of Arabia to the conventional battles of Iraq and Syria, he again modified his methods to match new challenges. The relationship between Khalid and the various leaders he served is also fascinating from a historical perspective. Muhammad recognized his talents immediately and gave him the famous nickname that would define his legacy. The first Caliph Abu Bakr trusted him with the crucial campaigns that secured the Islamic State's survival, and even Umar, who ultimately removed him from command, did so not because of any fault, but because of Khalid's very success. This story of a great commander being removed at the height of his success might seem tragic, but it actually demonstrates the strength of the early Islamic State. The fact that the government could survive the removal of its greatest military asset shows that the Muslim expansion was based on more than just individual brilliance. It was built on institutional strength and shared commitment to common goals. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Khalid leading his cavalry across the Syrian desert, appearing like a mirage to strike his enemies when they least expected it. Think about him standing on the battlefield at Yarmouk, calmly studying the terrain while planning the tactics that would change the world. Remember that true greatness in warfare isn't just about winning battles, it's about inspiring such loyalty and confidence in your followers that they believe they can achieve the impossible. Khalid proved that the greatest victories come not from superior numbers or better equipment, but from superior strategy, unshakable faith, and the kind of leadership that makes ordinary soldiers capable of extraordinary things. His legacy reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a spear, it's an undefeated spirit that refuses to accept failure as an option Sweet dreams, and may you carry some of Khalid's determination and tactical thinking into your own challenges. His story shows us that with the right combination of skill, courage, and faith, no obstacle is truly insurmountable. Chapter 3, Subutai, the Mongol Mastermind. Imagine being so skilled at warfare that you conquer more territory than Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon combined, not over a lifetime, but in just a few decades of brilliant military campaigns. Picture commanding armies across distances so vast that your messengers have to ride for months just to deliver orders, yet somehow coordinating attacks with such precision that enemies thousands of miles apart fall on the same day. This isn't fantasy. This is the real story of Subutai, a Mongol general whose name struck terror into the hearts of everyone from Chinese emperors to European kings, and who never lost a single battle in over 60 years of warfare. Subutai was born around 1175 AD in the windswept grasslands of Mongolia, into a world that most people would consider impossibly harsh. The Mongol steppes were a place where winter temperatures could drop to 50 degrees below zero, where survival depended on your ability to live with horses and herds of animals, and where the difference between life and death often came down to your skill with a bow and arrow. His family belonged to the Uriankai clan, a group of reindeer herders who lived even further north than most Mongols, in the forests near Lake Baikal. These people were considered somewhat mysterious by the other Mongol tribes. They lived differently, spoke with different accents, and had skills that seemed almost magical to the horse-riding nomads of the southern steppes. Subutai would carry this air of mystery with him throughout his career, becoming known as a man who could see patterns and possibilities that others missed entirely. When Subutai was young, the Mongol world was in chaos. Dozens of tribes fought constantly among themselves, raiding each other's herds, kidnapping each other's women, and forming temporary alliances that would dissolve the moment a better opportunity came along. It seemed impossible that these fractured, feuding groups could ever unite, let alone conquer most of the known world. But then a young tribal leader named Temujin began doing something extraordinary. Instead of just winning battles, he was building lasting alliances and creating a unified Mongol nation. Temujin would later become known as Genghis Khan, but when young Subutai first joined his service, he was still just one warlord among many, trying to survive in the brutal world of steppe politics. Subutai's rise in Genghis Khan's service was meteoric, but it wasn't because of his family connections or political influence. It was purely based on his incredible military genius. While other young warriors impressed their leaders with personal bravery or skill with weapons, Subutai showed something much rarer: the ability to think strategically about entire campaigns and to coordinate complex military operations across vast distances. The Mongols had always been excellent individual warriors, but they had never had commanders who could organize them into a truly effective military machine. Subutai changed that. He understood that the Mongols' greatest advantages, their mobility, their skill with horses and bows, and their ability to survive in harsh conditions, could be turned into weapons of conquest if they were properly coordinated. Subutai's first major independent command came during Genghis Khan's campaign against the Western Jia Kingdom in what is now northwestern China. While Genghis Khan attacked the main Jia forces, Subutai was given a relatively small army and told to prevent any enemy reinforcements from reaching the battlefield. It seemed like a secondary role, but Subutai turned it into something much more significant. Instead of simply blocking enemy reinforcements, Subutai conducted a brilliant campaign of maneuver that destroyed several Shi'ar armies before they could even reach the main battle. His forces moved so quickly and struck so unexpectedly that the Shi'ar commanders couldn't figure out where he was or where he would attack next. By the time Genghis Khan had defeated the main enemy army, Subutai had already conquered half the kingdom. This campaign established the pattern that would define Subutai's entire career. He didn't just win battles, he won them so decisively and creatively that his enemies often surrendered without fighting. His reputation began to spread among the Mongol tribes, and other commanders started studying his tactics, trying to understand how he achieved such incredible results with relatively small forces. When Genghis Khan decided to expand beyond Mongolia and attack the Jin dynasty in northern China, Subutai was given an even more challenging assignment. The Jin had built extensive fortifications along their northern border, including walls, forts, and watchtowers designed to keep nomad raiders out. Most military commanders would have seen these defenses as a serious obstacle, but Subutai saw them as an opportunity. Instead of attacking the Jin fortifications head-on, Subutai developed a strategy that completely bypassed them. He led his army on a massive flanking movement that took them hundreds of miles out of their way, through terrain that the Jin considered impassable for a large military force. When Subutai's army emerged behind the Jin defenses, the Chinese commanders were so shocked that many fortresses surrendered without a fight. This campaign showed another of Subutai's key innovations. He understood that in warfare, the unexpected route is often the most effective route. While his enemies were preparing to defend against conventional attacks, Subutai would find ways to approach from directions they had never considered. His armies seemed to appear out of nowhere, striking at the heart of enemy territory, while their forces were still positioned to defend the borders. Subutai's greatest test came during the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Muslim state that controlled much of Central Asia and Persia. The Khwarezmian Shah had made the fatal mistake of insulting Genghis Khan and executing his ambassadors, which gave the Mongols the excuse they needed for a war of conquest. But the Khwarezmian Empire was enormous, with dozens of fortified cities and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Genghis Khan's strategy for this campaign was characteristically brilliant. Instead of trying to conquer the entire empire with one massive army, he divided his forces and gave different commanders specific objectives. Subutai was assigned one of the most challenging tasks. He was to pursue the fleeing Khwarezmian Shah with a relatively small force, prevent him from organizing resistance, and keep him running until he could be captured or killed. What followed was one of the most extraordinary pursuits in military history. Subutai chased the Shah and his entourage across thousands of miles of deserts, mountains, and steppes through what is now Iran, Azerbaijan, and southern Russia. The pursuit took over 2 years and covered more distance than most medieval armies would travel in their entire existence. Throughout this chase, Subutai had to solve problems that would have defeated lesser commanders. He had to keep his army supplied in hostile territory, find routes through terrain that local guides said was impassable, and maintain the speed necessary to prevent his quarry from escaping. He did all of this while fighting dozens of battles against local forces, trying to slow him down. The pursuit finally ended when the Shah died of exhaustion and despair on a small island in the Caspian Sea. But Subutai wasn't finished. He had been ordered not just to pursue the Shah, but to explore the lands beyond the Mongol Empire and gather intelligence about potential future conquests. So he continued westward with his small army, entering territory that no Mongol force had ever seen. What Subutai discovered during this reconnaissance mission would shape Mongol strategy for the next generation. He found that the kingdoms of Eastern Europe were rich, divided, and militarily weak compared to the enemies the Mongols had already defeated. His reports to Genghis Khan described a region ripe for conquest, filled with cities that could barely defend themselves and armies that used outdated tactics. But Subutai didn't just gather intelligence, he also tested the military capabilities of these European kingdoms. When a combined Russian and Cuman army tried to stop his small force at the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, Subutai gave them a demonstration of Mongol military superiority that would be remembered for centuries. The Russian princes had assembled what they thought was an overwhelming force, with heavily armored knights, large numbers of infantry, and allied Cuman horse archers. They were confident that their superior numbers and armor would easily defeat what seemed to be just another nomad raiding party. They had no idea they were facing one of the greatest military geniuses in history. Subutai's tactics at Kalka River became a textbook example of how to defeat a larger enemy force. He used a feigned retreat to draw the Allied army out of their defensive positions, then turned and attacked when they were strung out and disorganized. His horse archers showered the enemy with arrows while staying just out of reach of their weapons, while his heavy cavalry struck at exactly the right moments to maximize damage. The battle was a complete disaster for the Russians and Cumans. Most of their army was destroyed, many of their princes were killed, and the survivors fled in panic. But perhaps most importantly from Subutai's perspective, he had learned everything he needed to know about European military capabilities. These armies were brave but inflexible, well-equipped but poorly coordinated, and completely unprepared for the kind of mobile warfare that the Mongols had perfected. After completing his reconnaissance mission, Subutai returned to Mongolia with intelligence that would prove invaluable for future campaigns. But he also brought something else, a reputation as a commander who could win impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Stories of his pursuit of the Shah and his victory at Kalka River spread throughout the Mongol Empire, cementing his status as Genghis Khan's most trusted general. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, many people expected the Mongol Empire to fragment as his sons fought for control, but Subutai played a crucial role in maintaining Mongol unity and continuing their expansion. He served Genghis Khan's successor, Ogedei Khan, with the same loyalty and brilliance he had shown the founder of the empire. Under Ogedei Khan, Subutai was given command of the campaign to complete the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. This was a challenging assignment because the Jin had learned from their previous defeats and had improved their defenses significantly. They had built new fortifications, adopted some Mongol tactics, and formed alliances with other Chinese states to resist Mongol expansion. But Subutai was no longer the relatively junior commander he had been during the early campaigns. He was now the most experienced and successful general in the Mongol Empire, with decades of victories behind him and an almost supernatural understanding of how to defeat any type of enemy. His campaign against the Jin became another masterpiece of strategic thinking and tactical execution. Instead of simply attacking Jin fortifications, Subutai developed a comprehensive strategy that attacked the enemy state at every level. He used economic warfare, cutting off trade routes and destroying agricultural areas to starve the Jin cities into submission. He used psychological warfare, spreading rumors and propaganda that undermined Jin morale. And he used diplomatic warfare, turning Jin allies against them and preventing the formation of effective coalitions. The siege of Kaifeng, the Jin capital, showed all of Subutai's skills at their peak. The city was enormous by medieval standards, with over 1 million inhabitants and some of the strongest fortifications in the world. A conventional siege would have taken years and cost thousands of Mongol lives, but Subutai's approach was anything but conventional. He surrounded the city not just with soldiers, but with a complete infrastructure of siege warfare. His engineers built siege engines that could breach the walls. His administrators organized supply lines that could feed the besieging army for months, and his intelligence officers gathered information about conditions inside the city. Most importantly, Subutai coordinated the siege with military operations throughout the Jin territory, preventing any relief forces from reaching Kaifeng. The siege lasted over a year, but it was never really in doubt. Subutai's systematic approach gradually wore down the defenders' ability to resist. When the city finally surrendered, it marked the effective end of the Jin dynasty and added millions of subjects to the Mongol Empire. But Subutai's greatest campaign was still ahead of him. In the 1230s, Ugadei Khan decided to launch the invasion of Europe that Subutai had recommended based on his earlier reconnaissance. This would be the largest coordinated military operation in medieval history, involving multiple armies attacking across a front that stretched from Poland to Hungary. The European invasion showcased everything that made Subutai a military genius. He had to coordinate attacks by armies that were separated by hundreds of miles, time his movements to achieve maximum surprise, and adapt his tactics to fight enemies who used completely different military systems from anything the Mongols had previously encountered. Subutai's strategy for the European campaign was breathtakingly ambitious. Instead of conquering one kingdom at a time, he planned to attack several countries simultaneously, preventing them from forming effective alliances against the Mongols. His northern army would invade Poland and destroy any forces there, while his southern army would conquer Hungary and establish a base for further operations. The coordination required for this strategy was extraordinary. Remember, this was the 13th century. There were no radios, no telegraphs, no way to communicate instantly across long distances. Yet somehow Subutai managed to coordinate his armies so precisely that they achieved their objectives almost exactly on schedule. The invasion of Poland was swift and devastating. Subutai's northern army destroyed a Polish army at the Battle of Mohi, killed Duke Henry II of Silesia, and captured several major cities. But this wasn't random destruction. Every move was calculated to support the overall strategic plan. By conquering Poland quickly, Subutai prevented Polish forces from marching south to help defend Hungary. Meanwhile, the main Mongol army, under Subutai's direct command, was advancing through Hungary, using tactics that completely confused the Hungarian defenders. Instead of following predictable invasion routes, the Mongols split into multiple columns that attacked from several directions at once. Hungarian scouts couldn't figure out where the main Mongol force was or where they would attack next. The decisive battle of the Hungarian campaign came at Mohi, where Subutai faced King Bela IV of Hungary and the largest army that had ever been assembled in Eastern Europe. The Hungarians were confident in their chances. They had more soldiers than the Mongols. They were fighting on familiar territory, and they had chosen a strong defensive position behind a river. But Subutai had been studying this battlefield for months, and he had developed a battle plan that would become one of the classic examples of military strategy. Instead of attacking the Hungarian position directly, he divided his army and sent part of it on a night march to cross the river several miles upstream. When morning came, the Hungarians found themselves attacked from two directions simultaneously. The Battle of Mohi was fought in April 1241, and it demonstrated every aspect of Subutai's tactical genius. His armies coordinated their attacks perfectly, despite being separated by several miles. His horse archers used their mobility to stay out of reach of Hungarian heavy cavalry while inflicting devastating casualties with their bows, and his heavy cavalry struck at exactly the right moments to break Hungarian formations. The Hungarian army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. King Bela IV barely escaped with his life, and most of the Hungarian nobility was killed on the battlefield. In a single day, Subutai had effectively destroyed the military power of one of Europe's largest kingdoms. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Battle of Mohi was its timing. On the very same day that Subutai was destroying the Hungarian army, his subordinate commanders were winning the Battle of Legnica in Poland, over 300 miles away. This kind of coordination across such vast distances was unheard of in medieval warfare, and it demonstrated Subutai's ability to plan and execute operations of unprecedented complexity. After Mohi, nothing stood between the Mongol armies and the heart of Western Europe. Subutai's forces had proven they could defeat any European army, and there seemed to be no obstacle that could prevent them from conquering France, Germany, and even England. European chroniclers wrote in terror about the approach of what they called the Devil's Horsemen, and some predicted that the end of the world was at hand. But then, something unexpected happened that saved Western Europe from Mongol conquest. In December 1241, news reached Subutai that Ogedei Khan had died back in Mongolia. According to Mongol law, all the royal princes had to return to Karakorum, the Mongol capital, to elect a new great Khan. This meant that the European invasion had to be suspended just when it was on the verge of complete success. Subutai was reportedly furious about having to abandon his campaign when victory was so close. He had spent years planning the conquest of Europe. He had already defeated the strongest armies that could be assembled against him, and he knew that completing the conquest would establish Mongol control over most of the known world. But duty to the empire came first, so he led his armies back across the steppes to Mongolia. The succession crisis in Mongolia lasted for several years, and by the time it was resolved, the window of opportunity for conquering Europe had closed. The new Great Khan, Möngke, decided to focus Mongol expansion on other directions, particularly the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. Subutai continued to serve the Mongol Empire for the rest of his life, leading campaigns in China and Central Asia until he was well into his 70s. But he never got another chance to complete the conquest of Europe that had come so close to success. He died around 1248, having served 4 different great Khans and having never lost a single battle in over 60 years of warfare. Subutai's military record is almost impossible to comprehend. He conquered more territory than any other general in history, commanding armies across distances that spanned from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. He won battles in forests, deserts, mountains, and plains, adapting his tactics to defeat enemies who used completely different military systems. And he did it all while maintaining the kind of strategic vision that allowed him to coordinate operations across entire continents. What made Subutai truly extraordinary wasn't just his tactical brilliance, though he certainly had that in abundance. It was his ability to see warfare as a science that could be studied, understood, and perfected. He approached each campaign like a master chess player, thinking several moves ahead and anticipating his enemies' responses before they even knew what they were going to do. Subutai also understood something that many other great commanders missed, that the greatest victories come not from winning individual battles, but from winning them in such a way that they contribute to larger strategic objectives. Every battle he fought was part of a broader plan, Every victory built toward greater conquests, and every campaign served the ultimate goal of expanding Mongol power and influence. Perhaps most impressively, Subutai managed to maintain his effectiveness and adapt his methods throughout a career that spanned revolutionary changes in military technology and tactics. He fought against Chinese armies that used gunpowder weapons, European knights in heavy armor, Muslim forces with sophisticated siege equipment, and nomadic tribes with traditional steppe tactics. Against each type of enemy, he developed new approaches and innovations that kept him ahead of his opponents. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Subutai standing on a hill overlooking the battlefield at Mohi, calmly watching as his perfectly coordinated battle plan unfolds exactly as he had envisioned it months earlier. Think about him leading his small army across thousands of miles of unknown territory in pursuit of the Khwarezmian Shah, never losing sight of his objective despite facing countless obstacles. Remember that true military genius isn't about winning through superior force, but about winning through superior thinking. Subutai proved that with enough intelligence, planning, and determination, even the most impossible military objectives could be achieved. He showed that the greatest victories come to those who can see patterns and possibilities that others miss, who can coordinate complex operations across vast distances, and who never stop learning and adapting their methods. His legacy reminds us that excellence in any field requires not just talent, but the kind of systematic thinking and relentless preparation that turns natural ability into unstoppable expertise. Sweet dreams, and may you bring some of Subutai's strategic thinking and attention to detail to whatever challenges you face in your own life. Chapter 4: Yi Sunsen, the admiral who saved a nation. Picture this: your country is being invaded by one of the most powerful military forces in the world, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and a naval fleet so large it seems to cover the entire ocean. Your own navy has been almost completely destroyed. Your cities are burning, and your king has fled to the mountains. Everyone expects your nation to fall within months, if not weeks. Now imagine being the one person who refuses to give up, who takes command of just 13 warships. 13, and proceeds to win battle after battle until you've completely turned the tide of the entire war. This is the incredible true story of Yi Sunsen, a Korean admiral whose tactical genius and unbreakable determination saved his country from conquest and earned him a place among history's greatest naval commanders. Yi Sunsen was born in 1545 in Korea during the Joseon dynasty, a time when his country was caught between two giant neighbors who seemed to take turns threatening its independence. To the west was Ming China, the Middle Kingdom that considered Korea a vassal state. To the east was Japan, a nation of warriors that was just beginning to dream of conquering the entire Asian continent. Korea was like a small house sitting between two enormous, occasionally feuding neighbors, and Yi Sunsen grew up understanding that his country's survival might one day depend on people like him. As a young man, Yuri showed all the qualities that would later make him a legendary commander, but his path to greatness was far from smooth. He came from a relatively modest, noble family, not poor, but not wealthy enough to guarantee him a high position through connections alone. This meant that Yuri would have to earn his advancement through merit, which in Korea's rigid social system was much more difficult than it sounds. Yi's first attempt at the civil service examinations, the grueling test that determined who could serve in the government, ended in failure. But instead of giving up, he decided to pursue a military career, which was actually considered less prestigious than civilian service in Korean society. This turned out to be one of those moments when what seemed like a setback was actually perfect preparation for what lay ahead. Military life in 16th century Korea was tough and often thankless. Yai served on the northern frontier, defending against raids by Jurchen tribes from what is now Manchuria. These weren't the kind of grand campaigns that made people famous. They were small, brutal skirmishes in harsh terrain where survival depended more on practical skills than noble ideals. But this experience taught Yai everything he needed to know about logistics, leadership, and making quick decisions under pressure. During his time on the frontier, Yi developed a reputation as an officer who genuinely cared about his soldiers' welfare. He made sure they were properly fed, equipped, and trained, which might sound basic, but was actually quite unusual in an army where corruption and neglect were common problems. His men knew that Yi would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and that he would never waste their lives for his own glory. But Yi's military career almost ended before it really began, thanks to the kind of political intrigue that plagued many Korean institutions. He was falsely accused of abandoning his post during a battle, and was not only stripped of his rank, but actually tortured and imprisoned. For most people, this would have been a career-ending disaster, but Yi endured his punishment without complaint, and gradually worked his way back into military service. This experience of disgrace and redemption taught Yida something crucial about leadership, that true authority comes not from rank or titles, but from competence and character. When he eventually rose to high command, his soldiers followed him not because they had to, but because they trusted him completely. They had seen that he could endure hardship and injustice without losing his integrity, which meant they could count on him to see them through anything. In 1591, Yai Sunsen was appointed as the naval commander of the left Jola province, one of 3 naval districts responsible for defending Korea's southern coast. At the time, this seemed like a relatively routine posting. The Korean Navy hadn't fought a major sea battle in decades, and most people assumed that any future war would be fought primarily on land. Yai himself had limited naval experience, but he approached his new command with the same systematic thoroughness he had brought to everything else in his career. What Yi found when he took command was both alarming and inspiring. The Korean Navy was in terrible shape, ships were poorly maintained, sailors were undertrained, and the overall level of readiness was shockingly low. But Yi also discovered that Korea had access to some of the most advanced naval technology in the world, including a revolutionary new type of warship called the turtle ship that had been developed but never properly tested in combat. The turtle ship was unlike anything else on the seas at that time. It was essentially the world's first armored warship, with an iron-plated curved roof that protected the crew from arrows and boarding attempts while allowing Korean cannons to fire through gun ports along the sides. The design was so unusual that enemy sailors would initially be confused about what they were looking at, giving the turtle ship a crucial element of surprise in battle. But having advanced technology meant nothing without proper training and organization, so Yi threw himself into the task of preparing his fleet for war. He drilled his sailors relentlessly, improved their gunnery skills, and most importantly, developed new tactics that would take advantage of Korean strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. Yi understood that in any future naval war, Korea would probably be outnumbered, so he focused on creating a force that could win through superior skill and coordination rather than sheer numbers. Yi's preparation turned out to be perfectly timed, because in 1592, Japan launched the most ambitious military campaign in its history, a full-scale invasion of Korea that was intended to be just the first step in conquering Ming China and eventually all of Asia. The Japanese force was enormous by the standards of the time, over 150,000 soldiers transported by a fleet of nearly 1,000 ships. It was one of the largest amphibious invasions ever attempted, and it caught Korea almost completely off guard. The initial Japanese assault was devastatingly successful. Japanese armies landed at Busan and began advancing northward with frightening speed. Korean land forces, weakened by years of peace and internal political disputes, proved no match for the battle-hardened Japanese warriors, who had just emerged from over a century of near-constant warfare. Within just 2 months, Japanese forces had captured Seoul, the Korean capital, and were pushing toward the Chinese border. King Seonjo and the Korean court fled north in panic, eventually taking refuge in the city of Yeju near the Chinese border. Many Korean officials were ready to surrender, thinking that further resistance was hopeless against such an overwhelming invasion force. But Yi Sun-sin, commanding his small fleet from his base in the southwestern province of Jeolla, had different ideas entirely. While Japanese armies were winning victory after victory on land, Yu was about to demonstrate that the sea could tell a very different story. On May 16, 1592, just a month after the Japanese invasion began, Yu led his fleet of 24 ships in an attack on a Japanese naval force at Okpo. This would be the first of an incredible series of naval victories that would completely change the course of the war. The Battle of Okpo was a perfect introduction to Yu Sunsen's tactical genius. Instead of meeting the Japanese fleet in a traditional head-to-head battle, Yu used his superior knowledge of local waters to lure the enemy ships into a trap. He positioned his fleet so that the Japanese would have to attack while fighting against the wind and current, giving the Korean ships a significant advantage in maneuverability. When the battle began, Yai's ships moved with precision that shocked the Japanese commanders. The Korean vessels maintained perfect formation while delivering devastating cannon fire that the Japanese ships, which relied primarily on boarding tactics, simply couldn't match. The turtle ship, making its combat debut, proved to be exactly as effective as Yai had hoped. Japanese arrows bounced harmlessly off its armored deck, while its cannons punched holes through enemy hulls. The victory at Okpo was complete and decisive. Yevhe's fleet destroyed dozens of Japanese ships while losing none of their own, and hundreds of Japanese sailors drowned or were captured. But more importantly than the tactical victory was the psychological impact. Suddenly, the seemingly invincible Japanese invasion force had suffered a major defeat, and Korean resistance had a symbol of hope to rally around. He followed up his victory at Okpo with a series of naval battles that read like a masterclass in tactical innovation. At Sashan, he used a brilliant feinting maneuver to draw Japanese ships out of a protected harbor, then attack them in open water where his superior firepower could be most effective. At Dongpo, he coordinated with Korean ground forces to execute a combined land-sea assault that completely destroyed a Japanese base. But Yai's most famous victory came at the Battle of Hansan-do in July 1592, where he faced the largest Japanese naval force that had been assembled since the invasion began. The Japanese admiral Wakizaka Yasuharu commanded 73 ships and was confident that his numerical superiority would finally put an end to Korean naval resistance. Yai had only 56 ships, but he was about to demonstrate why numbers alone don't determine the outcome of naval battles. Yai's strategy at Hansan-do became known as the crane wing formation, and it's still studied in naval academies around the world today. He arranged his ships in a curved formation that resembled a crane spreading its wings, with his strongest vessels at the center and faster ships on the flanks. When the Japanese fleet attacked, thinking they were facing a conventional battle line, they sailed directly into what was essentially a maritime ambush. As the Japanese ships charged toward the center of Yi's formation, the Korean vessels on the flanks moved in to attack from the sides, while the ships in the center gave ground in a controlled retreat that drew the enemy deeper into the trap. Soon the Japanese found themselves surrounded on three sides by Korean ships that were pouring cannon fire into their ranks from close range. The Battle of Hansondo was a catastrophe for the Japanese Navy. They lost 59 ships out of 73, while Yi's fleet suffered minimal casualties. More importantly, this victory effectively ended Japanese control of the seas around Korea, cutting off the supply lines that the invasion forces desperately needed to sustain their advance. Without secure naval transportation, the Japanese armies on land began to run short of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Ye's naval victories were having exactly the strategic impact he had intended. The Japanese had planned their invasion, assuming they would control both the land and sea, allowing them to move troops and supplies wherever they were needed. But Ye's fleet had turned the Yellow Sea and the Korea Strait into Korean-controlled waters, forcing the Japanese to defend long, vulnerable supply lines that stretched all the way back to Japan. Throughout 1592 and 1593, Yi continued his campaign of naval warfare, winning battle after battle against increasingly desperate Japanese attempts to regain control of the seas. His reputation grew not just in Korea, but throughout East Asia. Chinese observers called him the greatest naval commander of the age, and even Japanese sources began to speak of him with grudging respect. But Yi's greatest test was still to come. In 1597, after several years of unsuccessful negotiations, Japan launched a second invasion of Korea, this time with an even larger force and better preparation for dealing with Korean naval tactics. Worse still, Yi Sunsen had been removed from command due to political intrigue at the Korean court and had been replaced by an admiral named Won-gyun, who promptly led the Korean fleet to disaster at the Battle of Chilcheonryang. When Yeo was hastily recalled to naval command after Won-gyun's defeat, he found himself facing the most impossible situation of his career. The Korean fleet had been almost completely destroyed, leaving him with only 13 ships, 13 to face a Japanese navy of over 300 vessels. Any reasonable person would have advised retreat or surrender, but Yeo Sun-sin was not interested in reasonable options. At the Battle of Myeongyang in October 1597, Yi achieved what many historians consider the most lopsided naval victory in history. With his tiny fleet of 13 ships, he faced a Japanese force of 333 vessels in the narrow straits near Myeongyang. The Japanese were so confident of victory that some of their commanders were already discussing how to divide up Yi's ships as prizes after the battle. Yi's strategy at Myeongyang was based on his intimate knowledge of local tidal conditions. He positioned his small fleet at a point where the tide would turn during the battle, creating powerful currents that would work to his advantage while disrupting Japanese formations. He also chose a position where the narrow straits would prevent the Japanese from using their overwhelming numerical superiority effectively. When the battle began, Yi's ships fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat would mean not just their deaths, but the complete Japanese conquest of Korea. The Turtle Ship and other Korean vessels fired their cannons as fast as they could reload, while Yi himself moved from ship to ship, inspiring his sailors and personally directing the battle. The turning tide proved to be the decisive factor Yi had counted on. As the current shifted, Japanese ships found themselves fighting against the flow of water, while trying to maneuver in the narrow straits. Several Japanese vessels collided with each other or ran aground, and their tight formations broke apart into confusion. Uray's 13 ships managed to sink over 30 Japanese vessels and damage many more, while suffering only minor casualties themselves. The Japanese fleet, despite its enormous numerical advantage, was forced to retreat in confusion. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. A force outnumbered 25 to 1 had not just survived, but had actually won a decisive victory. The Battle of Mengyangyang marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese invasion. Once again, Korean control of the seas cut off Japanese supply lines and made it impossible to sustain their armies on land. Combined with Chinese military intervention and Korean guerrilla resistance, Yi's naval victories had turned what looked like certain defeat into eventual victory. Tragically, Sunsen never lived to see the final Japanese withdrawal from Korea. In 1598, during the last major naval battle of the war at Noryang, Yu was struck by a stray bullet and killed just as Korean and Chinese forces were completing their victory over the Japanese fleet. According to legend, his last words to his officers were, "Do not let the others know of my death," because he didn't want news of his death to demoralize his forces during the crucial final moments of the battle. Sunsen's death was mourned throughout Korea, and rightly so. Single-handedly, he had prevented the Japanese conquest of his country through a combination of tactical brilliance, technological innovation, and unbreakable determination. His naval victories had changed the entire strategic balance of the war, turning what seemed like inevitable defeat into ultimate victory. But Yi's legacy extends far beyond his military achievements. He showed that with enough skill, courage, and determination, even the most overwhelming odds can be overcome. His victory at Myeongyang, where 13 ships defeated 333, remains one of the most inspiring examples in military history of how superior strategy and tactics can triumph over superior numbers. Yi also demonstrated the importance of preparation and continuous learning. His success wasn't due to luck or divine intervention. It was the result of years of careful study, training, and innovation. He understood his equipment better than anyone else. He knew the waters around Korea like the back of his hand, and he had thought through every possible tactical scenario long before he ever faced it in battle. Perhaps most importantly, Yi Sunsen proved that true leadership isn't about having the most resources or the biggest army. It's about making the most of whatever you have. When he faced the Japanese fleet with only 13 ships, he didn't complain about being outnumbered or make excuses about why victory was impossible. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his strategy, his tactics, and his ability to inspire his men to fight beyond their normal limits. Yi's approach to warfare was also remarkably modern in its emphasis on combined operations and technological innovation. He understood that naval battles weren't just about ships fighting ships. They were about how naval power could support broader strategic objectives. His victories at sea directly enabled Korean resistance on land by cutting off Japanese supply lines and preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the battlefield. The turtle ship itself was a perfect example of Yi's innovative thinking. While other naval commanders were content to use traditional designs and tactics, Yi was constantly looking for ways to gain technological advantages over his enemies. The turtle ship's armored design made it nearly invulnerable to the boarding tactics that Japanese forces relied on, while its powerful cannons could punch through enemy hulls from safe distances. But technology alone wasn't enough. Yi also had to develop new tactics to make the most of his advanced ships. The crane wing formation he used at Hansen-do was a tactical innovation that perfectly matched the capabilities of his fleet with the weaknesses of his enemies. He had studied Japanese naval tactics carefully and designed his strategy specifically to counter their strengths while exploiting their vulnerabilities. Yai's ability to adapt his tactics to different situations was another mark of his genius. At Okpo, he used geography and weather to his advantage. At Hansan-do, he employed a complex formation that required precise coordination. At Myeongyang, he relied on his knowledge of tidal patterns to overcome impossible odds. Each battle required a different approach, and Yai always seemed to find exactly the right strategy for each situation. The psychological aspect of Yi's victories was just as important as the tactical aspects. After his first few battles, Japanese naval commanders began to approach any engagement with Korean forces with fear and uncertainty. They knew they were facing an opponent who had never been defeated, who seemed to anticipate their moves before they made them, and who had a reputation for pulling off impossible victories. This psychological advantage often meant that Yi's battles were won before they even began. Yuret's relationship with his sailors was also crucial to his success. Unlike many commanders of his era who treated their subordinates as expendable resources, Yurei genuinely cared about the welfare of his men. He made sure they were well trained, properly equipped, and fairly treated. In return, they gave him a level of loyalty and dedication that enabled his small fleets to fight with effectiveness far beyond their numbers. The diary that Io kept throughout the war provides fascinating insights into his personality and leadership philosophy. He wrote about his concerns for his soldiers, his frustration with political interference from the court, and his determination to defend his country no matter what the cost. The diary shows a man who was deeply thoughtful about his responsibilities and completely committed to his duty, even when that duty required him to face seemingly impossible odds. Yoi's influence on Korean culture extends far beyond his military achievements. He became a symbol of Korean resistance to foreign domination, and his example inspired generations of Koreans to believe that their small country could stand up to much larger and more powerful neighbors. Even today, Yoi Sunsen is considered Korea's greatest national hero, and his image appears on Korean currency and monuments throughout the country. The international recognition of Yi's achievements has grown significantly in recent years, as military historians have gained access to more detailed records of his campaigns. Naval academies around the world now study his tactics, particularly the Battle of Myeongyang, as examples of how superior strategy can overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantages. Some military analysts consider him one of the greatest naval commanders in history, ranking him alongside figures like Horatio Nelson and John Paul Jones. Yai's story also provides valuable lessons about the importance of persistence in the face of adversity. His career was marked by repeated setbacks, false accusations, political persecution, and the near destruction of his fleet, but he never gave up or lost faith in his mission. Each time he was knocked down, he got back up and continued fighting, usually emerging stronger than before. The technological innovations that Yi pioneered had lasting impacts on naval warfare. The turtle ship was essentially the first ironclad warship, predating similar European developments by several centuries. His emphasis on cannon fire over boarding tactics represented a fundamental shift in naval strategy that would eventually be adopted by navies around the world. In many ways, Yi was centuries ahead of his time in understanding how naval warfare was evolving. Yai Sunsen's undefeated record, never losing a single naval battle in over 6 years of warfare, puts him in an extremely exclusive category of military commanders. But what makes his achievements even more remarkable is that he accomplished this while consistently being outnumbered, often by enormous margins. His victory at Myeongyang, where he faced odds of 25 to 1, remains one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The strategic impact of Yi's naval victories cannot be overstated. Without his control of the seas, the Japanese invasion of Korea would almost certainly have succeeded, which would have given Japan a secure base for their planned conquest of China. The entire history of East Asia might have been different if not for one Korean admiral who refused to accept defeat. Yu's legacy also demonstrates the crucial importance of individual leadership in determining historical outcomes. Korea had other capable military leaders during the Japanese invasions, but none of them achieved anything close to Yu's level of success. His unique combination of tactical genius, technological innovation, and inspirational leadership made him irreplaceable in Korea's struggle for survival. The lessons from Yi Sunsen's career remain relevant today for anyone facing overwhelming challenges. He showed that with enough preparation, creativity, and determination, even the most impossible seeming obstacles can be overcome. He proved that true strength comes not from having the most resources, but from making the most effective use of whatever resources you have. You also demonstrated that innovation and adaptability are often more important than tradition and conventional wisdom. While his enemies relied on tactics and technologies that had worked in the past, Yal was constantly looking for new approaches that would give him advantages in current and future conflicts. His willingness to experiment and take calculated risks was a key factor in his success. Perhaps most importantly, Yi Sunsen showed that one person with enough courage and determination really can change the course of history. When the Japanese invasion began, Korea seemed doomed to conquest. But Yi's refusal to give up, combined with his extraordinary skills as a naval commander, single-handedly changed the outcome of the entire war. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Yi Sun-sin standing on the deck of his flagship at Myeongyang, calmly watching as 333 enemy ships approached his tiny fleet of 13 vessels. Think about his absolute confidence that superior strategy and tactics would overcome impossible odds. Remember that he had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, studying every aspect of naval warfare until he understood it better than anyone alive. Yi's story reminds us that greatness isn't about never facing difficulties. It's about how we respond when difficulties seem insurmountable. He faced political persecution, overwhelming enemy forces, and the near destruction of everything he had worked to build. But each time, he found a way to turn setbacks into comebacks, defeats into victories, and hopeless situations into triumphs. His legacy shows us that with enough preparation, innovation, and determination, we can overcome challenges that seem impossible. Yi Sun-sin proved that the only limits are the ones we accept, and that sometimes the greatest victories come to those who refuse to acknowledge that victory is impossible. Sweet dreams, and may you carry some of Yi Sun-sin's strategic thinking, innovative spirit, and unbreakable determination into whatever battles you face in your own life. His example reminds us that true warriors are defined not by their weapons or their armies, but by their refusal to give up when everything seems lost.